Real crime cases that are too shocking to believe. It was Father's Day, June 20th, 1965. Houston, Texas was suffocating under its summer heat, the kind of sticky warmth that makes the air hum and the silence heavier than usual. Neighbors along Driscoll Street hadn't seen Fred and Edwina Rogers for a few days. The elderly couple were quiet but polite, the kind of people who waved from their porch and kept to themselves. But when the police knocked on their door for a welfare check that afternoon, the house gave off a feeling that every officer recognized instantly: something wasn't right. The blinds were drawn. The mail had piled up. And the smell? It wasn't just bad. It was wrong. When Officer Charles Bullock pushed open the back door, the air hit him like a wall, thick, metallic, and sour. Inside, the small, neat home looked untouched. Everything in its place. The calendar on the wall was marked Father's Day. A half-eaten breakfast still sat on the kitchen table. Then Bullock opened the refrigerator. At first, it looked like someone had stored several packages of butchered meat, neatly wrapped in paper, stacked in rows. But when he unwrapped one bundle, he froze. What he saw wasn't pork or beef. It was a piece of human flesh, pale, cold, and unmistakably real. Inside that refrigerator were the dismembered remains of Fred and Edwina Rogers. Their heads were found in the vegetable drawer. Bullock stumbled back, retching. The rest of the officers who arrived moments later would never forget that scene. The precision of the cuts, the eerie cleanliness of the kitchen, and the fact that not a single drop of blood could be found on the floor. Whoever did this cleaned up afterward. And that meant one terrifying thing. The killer had taken their time. The first question was obvious. Who would do this? Fred Rogers was 81. Edwina was 72. They had no known enemies. No signs of forced entry, no robbery, no struggle. But there was someone else who lived in the house. Someone the neighbors said they almost never saw. Their son, Charles Frederick Rogers. Charles was 43 years old, a reclusive man with an IQ well above genius level. He'd once been a Navy pilot and a seismologist for Shell Oil, but by the early 60s, he'd quit his job without explanation. He rarely spoke to anyone. In fact, most neighbors didn't even know he still lived there. His parents would slide food under his bedroom door. The door to his room, when officers tried it, was locked from the inside. They forced it open. Inside, they found maps of South America, engineering textbooks, and, most disturbing of all, a bloodstain on the floor. It had soaked deep into the wood. His closet was empty. His bed neatly made. His car was gone. And so was Charles. Detectives pieced together the timeline. Based on the state of decomposition, Fred and Edwina had been dead for roughly 3 days. But neighbors reported hearing heavy thuds and loud arguing late on June 17th, followed by silence. The medical examiner's report deepened the mystery. Fred had been bludgeoned with a hammer and then shot in the head. Edwina had been beaten and shot as well, both after death. Their bodies were drained of blood in the bathroom, dismembered with surgical precision, and neatly stored in the fridge. There were no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no trace of Charles. But something about the way the house was cleaned and the careful placement of the remains made detectives feel this wasn't rage. It was control. Cold, methodical control. The story exploded across Houston the next morning. Newspapers dubbed it the Icebox Murders. The press descended on Driscoll Street, and theories multiplied by the hour. Was Charles a lunatic who finally snapped after years of tension with his parents? Or was there something else going on behind those closed doors? Neighbors painted an odd picture of the family. Fred was domineering. Edwina, quiet but submissive. And Charles, the unseen son who left home early every morning, only to return after midnight. Nobody ever saw him leave through the front door. Some swore he had built a secret exit through the attic or garage, slipping in and out unseen. That detail made detectives wonder, how long had Charles been planning this? They found one more clue in his desk, a small scrap of paper, folded into a triangle. Written in tiny, precise handwriting was a list of coordinates and the words, John F. Kennedy, Dallas, 11/22/63. At first, investigators thought it was a prank. But when they realized the coordinates pointed to the same area as several CIA-related facilities, the rumor mill went wild. Some began to believe Charles Rogers wasn't just a killer, he was connected to something far bigger. By the end of that first week, Houston police had a full manhunt underway. They searched airports, train stations, ports. Nothing. It was as if Charles Rogers had vanished into thin air. But one detective noticed something strange in the attic, a small crawl space leading out to the garage roof. Dust patterns showed it had been used recently. From there, it was possible to climb down into the alley and disappear into the city. That meant one terrifying possibility. Charles Rogers hadn't run away days ago. He might have been watching the house when police arrived. And the last thing any officer wanted to admit was that the man who butchered his own parents might still be out there, silent, brilliant, and one step ahead. But when they reopened the refrigerator later that night to re-examine the contents, they found something none of them had noticed before. Stuffed behind the packages of meat was a folded piece of paper, and written in tiny block letters were the words, "Look higher." Houston had seen bad crimes before, but nothing like this. The papers called it the House of Quiet Horror. Reporters crowded Driscoll Street, sketching gruesome headlines. And through it all, police kept coming back to one question: where was Charles Rogers? The note they found in the fridge, "Look higher," rattled every detective in the room. It wasn't a random taunt. It was a clue written by someone who wanted to be understood or someone who wanted to play. Detective James Hickey, the lead investigator, climbed back into the Rogers attic that evening. The air was heavy with heat and fiberglass dust. As his flashlight cut across the beams, he spotted a gap in the insulation that looked recently disturbed. Beneath it, a small, square crawl space. Inside was a stack of old papers, a portable radio, and a coffee can filled with cigarette butts. Someone had been living up there. And when Hickey leaned in closer, he saw something else. A hole drilled into the floorboards that gave a perfect view down into the living room below. Charles had been watching his parents from above. Investigators pieced together that Charles, who'd worked as a seismologist and engineer, had quietly modified the house over years, building hidden passages, false walls, and small listening tunnels through the attic and basement. Neighbors always wondered how he seemed to vanish from a house with only one visible exit. Now they knew. Fred and Edwina Rogers had lived with a ghost. Hickey's team found bank statements and letters that deepened the family tension. Fred had drained Charles's savings, and Edwina had forged signatures on property documents. Charles was trapped financially, unable to sell, unable to leave. It wasn't hard to imagine how resentment built in silence. But still, this crime wasn't impulsive. It was planned. Whoever did this had cleaned the blood with bleach, wrapped the remains precisely, and hidden the evidence in such a clinical way that the coroner described it as surgical. The question was no longer whether Charles had killed his parents. It was how a man that methodical could vanish so completely. 2 weeks after the discovery, the Houston police received a tip from a local dock worker. He swore he'd seen a man matching Charles's description boarding a cargo ship headed toward Mexico. The man was wearing sunglasses and carrying only a small duffel bag. Detectives rushed to trace the ship, but by the time they reached Galveston, it was gone. No manifest, no record, no customs stamp. Like his parents, Charles had simply disappeared. Months passed, and the story faded from national headlines. But in Houston, it became a local legend. The house on Driscoll Street sat abandoned. Teenagers dared each other to peek through the windows. Some claimed they saw light flickering upstairs at night. In 1969, a new owner bought the property and began renovations. Within days, the workers stopped showing up. They told the foreman the house wasn't right. One even quit on the spot after hearing what sounded like slow footsteps coming from the locked attic. When the foreman went up to check, the door handle was warm to the touch. But inside, nothing. Years later, a private investigator named Hugh and his partner Martha dove into the cold case after finding it mentioned in an old crime digest. They believed Charles Rogers was alive, and that the police had missed key connections tying him to government intelligence work. Through declassified files and interviews, they uncovered something astonishing. Charles had served as a pilot during the Korean War, fluent in multiple languages, and, according to one retired Shell executive, he'd done confidential mapping work for the CIA. The Rogers home, built in the early 1940s, was near an old network of storm tunnels and access lines connecting downtown Houston to the ship channel. If anyone could disappear through that labyrinth unseen, it was Charles. In 1975, a break seemed to come from an unlikely place. A missionary in Honduras reported an American hermit living deep in the jungle, calling himself John. He matched Charles's age and spoke fluent Spanish. When authorities arrived weeks later to verify, the camp was abandoned, the fire still warm, the bed freshly used. All they found was a notebook filled with coded letters and sketches of Houston streets. The last line read, "They're still watching me." But the more investigators uncovered, the stranger the connections became. Fred and Edwina weren't just victims. They may have been involved in something darker themselves. Rumors surfaced that Fred had ties to illegal bookmaking and that Edwina was managing hidden accounts for neighborhood gambling rings. Some speculated that Charles discovered they were laundering money through his name. The murder, then, might not have been madness, but retaliation. One night, decades later, an old retired cop who'd worked the case sat down with a local journalist. He told her something he'd never written in his report. "When we first opened that fridge," he said, "I remember thinking it was strange. Everything was lined up neat. But there was one package missing. Just one. Bottom row, middle spot." The journalist asked what he thought it was. He took a deep breath. "Charles's brain was exceptional," he said. "I think he wanted to make sure nobody ever studied it. He took that part of himself with him." And yet, even today, the story refuses to stay buried. Every few years, someone claims to have seen a man in South America who fits Charles's profile: tall, thin, silent. A man who always orders food to go. A man who doesn't look you in the eye. The Rogers home was demolished in 1972. But when city workers tore up the foundation, they discovered something embedded in the concrete. A small brass nameplate, worn but legible. C.F. Rogers, civil engineer. No one could explain how it got there, sealed under the floor since the house was built. Detective Hickey retired, haunted by the case. He often said he believed Charles had planned everything down to the final escape, that the murders were only part of a larger story we were never meant to understand. But one night, as he sat at his desk going over old photos, he noticed something that froze his blood. In one of the earliest crime scene shots, taken before they opened the refrigerator, the reflection in the window behind the kitchen counter showed a faint silhouette, not of any officer present. A man in a white undershirt, standing near the doorway. The timestamp proved it was taken after police entered. Whoever he was, he wasn't supposed to be there. And just as Hickey stared at that ghostly image, he realized something chilling. The man's face looked familiar. It was thin, pale, with sharp cheekbones and deep-set eyes. The same face he'd seen in the missing posters. Charles Rogers, standing inside his own crime scene.